So peace, y'all. So we still, here in the thick of Black History Month, and someone asked me, they were like, you should do, an episode, going through the different books or make some book recommendations. I've gotten that a lot, so I'm gonna do something of that, right? Just let me know in the comments what you think about, doing a book review periodically. If that's something that people would be interested in, I can go through some of my books. But one thing I'll do today for Black History Month is I'm gonna provide you a couple of books that I think are very good for the sake of Black history, and especially given the moment that we find ourselves in right now. And the first book that comes to mind is a book called White Rage. It is written by Dr. Carol Anderson, who was a Black American historian from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. This book was published in 2015. This book is a brilliantly written historical analysis and account of examples of what the author describes as white rage. And basically, in a nutshell, the book highlights whenever that there were a significant amount of Black progress, it was always met with this white rage. I mean, she goes back to like the Civil War, for example, and, the Reconstruction era and the Black power that came out of the ending of the Civil War, and how that was met with white rage, and how, eventually Blacks who became landowners and some who became, were able to hold positions within government were, stripped of those posts, and new laws and Reconstruction laws were put into place that kind of that stripped Blacks of their land, and put many of them back on the plantation as sharecroppers. She gives examples of Black communities that had been able to, become successful at building wealth and building communities and circulating wealth within Black communities and amongst Black people, and how those communities, as a result of white rage, were burned to the ground or destroyed or wiped off the face of the earth. So she gives all of these different examples, and the same with you can follow the pattern up until the 100 years of the segregated school system, where that produced some of the most dynastic Black Americans, you know what I mean, that we've known, physicians and engineers and leaders of industry, who all were products of segregated schools. And so the white rage that followed was the Brown versus Board of Education decision that destroyed the Black school system, the Black K through 12 school networks, and Black students, and the Black intellect hasn't recovered from that white rage incident. But the thing about the book, right, that's most interesting to me is that the book was, remember I told you it was published in 2015. So she gives all of these historical accounts that leads up to 2015. And what happened in 2016? Something very significant happened, right? So up from 2015, we're still under the presidency of Barack Obama. But 2016, President Trump takes the office. And the book doesn't cover that. But you can see the pattern of white rage after her book is published. To me, Trump is the historical trajectory of white rage that she outlined in the book. And this is pre-election of Donald Trump. But it's a good read. And I'm not trying to make a partisan argument. I'm a historian. I'm a person who, I'm on the side of Black people. I'm on the side of our history. I'm cognizant of, what our ancestors would want. I mean, obviously they're not here to tell us, but we can look at the things that they went through and the things that they aspired for. And I think one of the biggest disservices that we could do as Black people is forget about that. And by and large, we have. And so White Rage by Carol Anderson is a very good read. Another book, I won't talk too much about it, and I think just, for Black history purposes, is Gerald Horne, who's another historian. He's from the University of Houston, and he wrote a book called The Counter Revolution of 1776. He basically talks about the ways in which Black people in the U.S. were, fighting for their independence, fighting for their, their freedom, that they didn't just, by and large, just lay down and wait for Lincoln to sign, the Declaration of Independence, that Black folks were fighting for long periods of time throughout the United States, right? Wherein there were treaties signed between rebellious Black groups who fought to standstills and to secure treaties across places like Florida, places like South Carolina, places like Georgia, across the South. Examples of hardly talked about examples of resistance of Black people and Black communities fighting for their independence and fighting for freedom. We only hear about Nat Turner, but Nat Turner ended tragically. There are some other examples of communities who fought to standstills and reach treaties with their enemy. These are stories that we should know. They should be in circulation amongst us. So The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gerald Horne, who is a University of Houston historian. I highly recommend that book. But really, I think the Warmth of Other Suns, this particular book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, is by Isabel Wilkerson. She's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, National Books Critics Circle Award for nonfiction. This book won a significant amount of accolades. She again, another historian, Black American historian, Dr. Wilkerson. Phenomenal book. And basically, this book tells the story of Black Americans who went to places like Chicago and built communities in Chicago, went to places like Detroit, built up communities in Detroit, New York City, built up communities across New York City, went to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, these places, and a lot of the satellite towns in these places, as well as places like, across northern New Jersey, as well as Philadelphia, etc. Right? The Warmth of Other Suns is a journey where she follows specific individuals from different parts of the South, and in conversation with them about their journey from the South and where they went and why they chose the places that they chose, what they did when they reached where they reached. And so it's a very important historical document, and very important about Black Americans in the United States, especially because essentially we are all one tribe. As Black Americans in the United States, we are one tribe, because the Great Migration, as is laid out in The Warmth of Other Suns, saw the migration of, some people say between 6 and 10 million Black Americans who left the South. Mostly it was because of the constrictions in the Jim Crow South, right? The restrictions placed on Black people and Black families and Black communities, in the opening up of industries in other places, more job opportunities and things like that, and better lifestyles. A lot of it was fictitious and mythical, but a lot of it was real, because for economic purposes, you had a sort of a convergence of interests that allowed for white folks to tolerate the Black folks in ways that wasn't always the case in the South. And that contributed to a lot of the very prosperous and well-known communities that were built by Black people. But after reading The Warmth of Other Suns, it made me want to understand more about my family's journey. So I started to ask my mother and some of my relatives different questions about, our life or their lives in the South, and why they chose to leave and why they chose the places that they chose. I was kind of lucky in the sense that I grew up in a family that were very much, they were Southerners, but even though we lived up north, they were, they still had all the Southern values, all the Southern etiquette, and they raised us as Southerners. We just, were raised up north. And what I started to realize were that all my Black American friends were just like me. all of them came from families who migrated from the South. And then as I started to pan out even more, I started to realize that this is the case for Black Americans across the country, right? They all are sort of heirs of the Great Migration. What I did was, after I completed my doctorate studies, I ended up going, I read The Warmth of Other Suns when I was a PhD student. And that's the first time that I read the book. And then it really influenced me to write, as part of my positionality statement, as I talked about and wrote about and did research on the state of Black American schools and Black American children and Black American communities. And so eventually, once I, graduated with my doctorate degree, I decided to build on that positionality statement. And I wrote this book called The Heirs of the Great Migration, How the Past Became the Future, right? And because I felt like the Warmth of Other Suns positioned the story of the Great Migration as a relic of history that didn't continue, like, in their journey and in their struggle and in their, they just stopped being almost. So the Heirs of the Great Migration was me saying, okay, well, what about the generation of those of us who weren't born in the South, who inherited the migration of our ancestors? What about the children whose family left Mississippi and came up in Chicago? What's happening to those kids, right? Like, what's happening to my generation? What are we going through? What you know what I'm saying? Like, as the hip hop generation, like, how is it we're all connected? Like, what's our relationship to each other? And that's sort of what I write about in this book, The Heirs of the Great Migration. At the time that I grew up in Waterbury, all the industries had been offshored already, or they were on their way out. So as I'm coming of age, all of those factory jobs that pulled our ancestors out of the South to Waterbury, they're all gone. I can't understand. I'm too young to understand, like, why did y'all come here? I would ask my family, like, of all the places you could have came, why'd y'all come here? And then, they just tried as best as they could to help us understand, because Waterbury was the place to be. And it's a 1985 article written by James Brooks that describes Waterbury as the 19th century version of Silicon Valley. And now the town is just a ghost town, abandoned factories all over the place. But this is indicative across the Rust Belt as well, across places like Detroit, Gary, Indiana, Flint, Michigan. You know what I'm saying? Across Ohio and Pittsburgh, where you had these Black Americans who migrated from the South to these places because of the jobs and because the factory jobs and the industries and whatnot. And all of those places they abandoned the people who left everything behind. So what happened to the future? What happened to those generations? What happened to, the latter generations in Chicago and the latter Black American generations in LA and San Francisco and Oakland and New York? You find that many of them, even if they weren't born in the South, because a lot of us weren't, a lot of us found our way back to the South, right? They left those cities. People are leaving New York City. Black Americans are leaving New York City, going back south. Black Americans are leaving Chicago, leaving Detroit in droves and going back to cities in the South where they have aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins and whatnot, And so it's an interesting story. And so, like, growing up, in Waterbury at the height of deindustrialization, at the beginning of the hip hop generation, at the start of hip hop, influenced by all of that, in the midst of the crack epidemic, we found ourselves in all kinds of, circumstances. And so, like me, I was a product of my environment. Like most people, I got myself in trouble. And in 1991, 1992, those last 2 years, my last 2 years of high school, Money Magazine they would rank the top 300 urban cities in the United States. And they would rank them based on like a bunch of different measures, like statistics around crime, economics, education, job availability. But Waterbury met those standards, and Waterbury was ranked number 300 of 300. So what that means is Waterbury was ranked the worst urban metropolitan city to live in the United States, my junior and my senior years, back-to-back years. And it was believable. If you grew up in my city, if you was in my city at that time, it was believable. Like, I wasn't appalled by that. Like, I was like, yeah, sounds about right. And I couldn't wait to get out of there. I couldn't wait to leave the city because all around me was just, all my friends getting knocked off, either getting killed or getting, going to prison or, not getting kicked. You know what I mean? Like our schools wasn't preparing us for anything. The smartest kids amongst us they weren't pushed. They weren't engaged, right? And school just didn't, you know what I'm saying? Like even me, even when I finally made it back to school, like I was so unprepared for higher education. It was like I had to relearn how to learn. I don't even know if relearn is the right word, but I had to learn how to learn because I don't think I was ever taught in the Waterbury public schools how to learn. And I realized that what was happening, that what happened to me in Waterbury, the Waterbury public school system, and a public school system that was overwhelmingly white educators, and the handful of black educators that we did have in the Waterbury public school system, they all were, given marginal roles. They were all marginalized. But they had the biggest impact on us. The handful of black teachers that I had are the most memorable ones in my life right now today. And everybody I know, black, white, Puerto Rican, etc., when you mention the black educators to any of the people who went to school in my time, they'll tell you the same thing. They'll tell you the same thing. They'll tell you the impact that the black educators, the handful of them that we had, were the most impactful and the most significant. But yet they're far and few in between. We were excluded from the American dream in a lot of ways. And I think this is indicative of what happened to so many of our of the so-called heirs, or what I call the heirs of the Great Migration. Like, you see the same pattern across the country in places where Black Americans have migrated. So you see faulty New York City public school system. You see a faulty Philadelphia public school system. You see a faulty Chicago public school system. You see the same trends. These urban communities with overwhelmingly white educators and children who are below par. Not because they're not smart. It's not because they're stupid. Something else happening. So in any case, Heirs of the Great Migration was inspired by the warmth of other suns. And my gift to you during this Black History Month is I just listed 4 books. The first one was White Rage by Carol Anderson, and it is a phenomenal book that tracks the trajectory of white rage, as she calls it, or pushback against Black progress that in many cases involved the state. It wasn't just white communities. It was at the behest or with the blessings of the state apparatus to quell Black progress. I mean, it's a great read, and then The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gerald Horne, who is also a historian from the University of Houston. It's a really good book about various examples of slave revolts across the United States, various states that many of these revolts ended in treaties that people just don't know about, and I think we should be more aware of them. We shouldn't just, Nat Turner was, for all that we admire about him, there are other stories and even successful depictions or successful examples of slave revolts across the U.S., places like South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, etc. and maybe some other places. And then, of course, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which, uh, highlights the trajectory of Black Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South and opening or setting up shops and basically establishing communities across the United States. And then my book, The Heirs of the Great Migration, talking about the generations after the migration of Black Americans and what happened to them. And I just use myself as sort of like an anecdote, or like I use myself growing up in Waterbury and locating Waterbury as one of the great migration sites, actually a destination. Waterbury was a destination site. Like I said, New York Times article 1985 stated that Waterbury was the 19th century version of Silicon Valley. And we all know the impact of Silicon Valley. Now, that's high praise for Waterbury during the Industrial Revolution era. Like, it was very important to the war machine, production of materials, and then because of its manufacturing prowess, it pulled a lot of Black Americans from across the South, various states across the South. And so I think this is important for us to understand each other as brothers, as kinfolk, as a tribe of us from across the Northeast, the Midwest, the West Coast, and the South. The South is the seed. The South is the seed. We need to come to terms with that. Those folks who blazed the trail and left the South and opened up communities across the Midwest, the East Coast, and the West Coast. You know what I mean? Those individuals were trailblazers. And those are our ancestors, and those of us are Black Americans. We are cousins in that way, right? That's it for now, y'all. Peace.
Word up, quick to set it, don't wet it. Real niggas lick shots, peace, Connecticut.
Yo, what up, yo? Time is running out, it's for real though. Let's connect politics, ditto. We can change places.